Good afternoon, everybody. How can you hear me? Good? Yes? Okay. No? Better? Okay. Okay. My name is Donna Brondelli, for any of you that don't know me. I'm the chairman of the 350th Committee. We've been putting together programs for a year, since the beginning of June, for our 350th anniversary. They're going so well that we're probably going to continue doing programs into 25, 26. It'll continue on the first Sunday of the month at 4:30. We're going to keep them the same all the time. So we're hoping that more people will join us. We're always happy to see new faces and old faces. I've seen both here today. I want to introduce you to Mark Paritsky. For those that don't know him, he's our interim pastor here, and he'd like to do a welcome.
Yeah, I just want to say hello. Most of you probably already know. I know one person had to go and find the restroom. You are in a very old, wonderful, delightful building if you've not been here before, but it has no plumbing. However, we do have restrooms over there if you need them in that building, and food that we'll provide afterwards. And I just want to welcome you and say what a wonderful privilege it is to still be able to use this building in so many ways to worship, but also to just celebrate our wonderful history. And look forward to having you enjoy the presentation today. Thank you, and bless you all for being here.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind everybody that these programs, none of them could be possible without the dedication of the few people that we have on our committee. So if you're part of the 350th Committee, would you mind raising your hand or standing up, please? Please say thank you to all these people, because none of this happens without volunteers. So thank you from my heart. If you want to look at other future presentations that are coming up, they do go out on Facebook on a regular basis. If you're not seeing them there, go to our website. It's FCC, First Congregational Church, fccstonington.org. Okay, and all of our events are going to be located there as well. If you'd like to sign in, there's some sign-in sheets at the very entry. Put your email address legibly, please, and we're trying to put together an email chimp type of a thing so that you're notified when we have upcoming programs. All right, that's still new to us. We're still all new to all of this, but everything is going well for the most part, and we appreciate everybody's help. He's talked about the bathroom, so we're good to go. We do have a presentation in May, the first Sunday in May. It's going to be from the Denison Nature Center, so that'll be a nice, interesting presentation. She's done quite a few presentations around the area, and a lot of people are very familiar with her. We also have, in June, is going to be our Founders Day affair or festival or get-together, whatever you want to call it. And we're featuring local authors and artisans. So if you want to come see some local authors and artisans, they will be demonstrating their work. They'll be doing some readings. We'll have some children's games and activities here as well. And we're working on the presentations for June, July, August in the coming year. So let me introduce you to Walt Woodward. Many people know Walt. He is a multi-talented individual. He does a band as well as presentations. He was the Connecticut State Historian. He's the Connecticut State Historian Emeritus. He served as the State Historian Connecticut and member of the History Department at the University of Connecticut. And I just found out that both his son and daughter played for UConn. So all of those that are UConn fans and showed up to join us anyways, yes, thank you. We appreciate that. He was part of collecting all the historical documents and items and bringing it to us, bringing it to the people so that we understand what actually is going on in Connecticut and what happened in Connecticut so long ago. I don't want to say too much about Walt and what he's going to be doing, because I'd rather let Walt introduce himself. He'll do it much better than I anyways. So if you please welcome me and say thank you and welcome to Walt, I appreciate it. Here you go, Walt.
It is great to be here. The first history book that I wrote was about an early governor of Connecticut who was an alchemist. His name was John Winthrop Jr. And he, just to do this really quickly, he thought alchemy was the key to kind of reforming the world in preparation for the millennium. He was a Puritan, and that was then the connection between science and religion was real. The reason I'm telling you this is because one of the young men that he took under his wing when he came to Connecticut and he was trying to build a scientific community here was a young minister named James Noyes. So imagine my surprise when I walked in and found out that I am in the Noyes Church. Pretty cool. If you're a history geek, this is the stuff you thrive on. You know, you're just like, oh man. It's kind of like, you know, meeting Beyonce if you're a teenager. So I am excited to give this talk because we're coming up on it's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution has almost started 250 years ago today. People don't know it, but within the next 2 weeks, all hell is going to break loose on Lexington Green. So in that context, let's talk about one of the people who, when that shot heard around the world rang out, answered the call. And there's a surprise, at least it was a surprise to me about the story of Nathan Hale, and that was that somehow, well, I'll tell you, let me just leave it enigmatic. It's where there's smoke, there's fire. Can you hear me okay? There you go. Come, darling. Ah, sweet mystery. I should be better at this. I've done this before. Always clumsily, though, I must say. Okay, how we doing? We good? All right. So, each of us has lived through some of them. Some of us have lived through many of them. They're events of such profound impact that they're seared into our memories the instant we hear about them. They change our world, and the very news of their occurrence changes us. Ever after, we connect those events with the moment when and the place where we learned about them. Where were you when JFK was assassinated? Where were you when the Challenger exploded? Where were you when Bobby Kennedy died? When Martin Luther King was shot? When the wall came down? Somewhere where your moments hit harder because they hit so close to home. Not that long ago, Newtown was one of those moments. And before that, hard to believe that it was almost 24 years ago this year, that awful morning in New York that has permanently changed the way we think about the date, September 11th. On that date, I hope you still do this. I kind of made a commitment to, and I still do. On that date, every year for the rest of my life, I stop and relive that experience of that morning when nearly 3,000 of our fellow Americans died. It was a day filled with heroism and with horror. Now, I hope that on that date, like me, you give special thought to the 411 heroes, 343 firefighters, 60 police officers, and 8 paramedics who marched up those flights of stairs and died trying to save their fellow countrymen. That's a crucible of heroism it's worth working to never forget. But today I want to talk about another fire and a different hero whose story has a remarkable parallel to 9/11. I'm talking about a 21-year-old Connecticut and one of our state heroes, the male in our state hero department, who gave his life for his country, wow, what would it be, 249 years ago this September. Of course, I'm talking about Nathan Hale. Academic historians like me, I have to note, have in the pursuit of our craft not generally been kind to heroes, right? Academic history and heroes seem to be at odds with each other almost always lately, or the heroes are different people than the cast we normally have. That's because, I think, in a lot of cases, creating heroes and crafting histories are they're sometimes at odds. They're not the same thing. Scholars practicing their learned specialties are generally more interested in trying to approach their sources critically, at least that's what we say, rather than reverentially, let the chips fall where they may. It's the truth and I'm going to tell it. The results have not always been pretty. Often, as historians have clarified historic details, they've also called into question, or at least complicated, older heroic narratives. So it is with Nathan Hale, our state hero. The last decade has seen a substantial new outpouring of writing on Nathan Hale. One impetus behind this work was an acquisition by the Library of Congress in 2003 of a really interesting thing. It was a manuscript history of the American Revolution written by a Connecticut storekeeper and shopkeeper from Hartland named Consider Tiffany. Pretty cool name, right? Consider Tiffany. Yeah. Tiffany's multi-chapter pen and ink history of the war provided a previously unknown account of Hale's arrest as a spy in 1776 that corroborated some prior evidence and supplemented other sources, but overall, it cast Nathan Hale in a whole new light. Tiffany confirmed, for example, reports that the person who exposed Hale as a spy wasn't his loyalist cousin Samuel, as sources had for long suggested, but rather a man named Robert Rogers, who once was known to almost everyone as an American hero too. Rogers was the founder of Rogers Rangers, the crack colonial militia unit whose unconventional bushfighting techniques made them the elite fighting units of the French and Indian War, and the recognized progenitor of today's Army Special Forces. They still use a manual that takes things from the original Rogers manual. One of the reasons Rogers, who in the years after the French and Indian War was very much a hero to his contemporaries, one of the reasons he's less well known today is because during the American Revolution, Robert Rogers sided with the king. When Nathan Hale went to Washington seeking intelligence, Rogers was there. He was recruiting Redcoat Rangers. In Tiffany's account of Hale's capture, Rogers, who got an inkling that Hale just might be a spy, started to shadow him, and he disguised himself as a Patriot sympathizer. He, according to Tiffany, befriended Hale at a tavern. Rogers conspicuously drank a toast to Congress. Pretty risky, in Long Island in certain places. But he won the youthful Hale into his confidence by indicating that he, Rogers, was doing undercover surveillance for the Patriots on Long Island. Well, this was maybe after 2 or 3 toasts, maybe 4. And it led Hale to disclose his own secret mission. You think you're doing undercover work on Long Island. Guess what I'm doing? Well, at a second meeting arranged by Rogers, Hale again was enticed to talk about his intelligence gathering activities. Roger, once he had spilled the beans, stood up. He revealed his true identity. He called up a company of British troops he had arranged to have standing by, and they arrested Hale as a spy. At this point, Tiffany tells us, Hale acted like anything but a hero. He denied his name. I'm not Nathan Hale. He denied the business he came upon. Spy? I'm just trying to get work as a school teacher. He continued, Tiffany says, denying his name and spying activities all the way to the New York headquarters of British Commander William Howe. But when he got there, Tiffany noted, several persons recognized him, and they called him by his real name, and because of that, he was hanged as a spy. Now, it's a really different story than the one we were taught in school, right? Tiffany's account of Hale's panicky effort to save his skin certainly contrasts with the story that was given by William Hull, who was Hale's friend and a fellow American officer. Hull reported that upon being arrested, Hale immediately declared his name, his rank in the American Army, and his object in coming within British lines. No panic, no denials. Hull's story also insisted that Hale continued to display that same kind of manly composure and fortitude right up to the gallows. Fortitude's a big word in the 18th century. It's brave upon brave. And on those gallows, a very brave and patriotic Nathan Hale said, how many of you know what he's supposed to have said? I regret that I only have but one life to lose for my country. Well, so we got two stories, right? And clearly, both of these stories can't be right. And in fact, it's most likely that neither of those stories is completely right. Mary Beth Baker, who wrote a considered analysis of both these primary sources and their authors, points out that neither Consider Tiffany nor William Hull were eyewitnesses to Nathan Hale's arrest or his execution. They weren't there. Their accounts are at best based on hearsay evidence. Moreover, she calls our attention to the fact that each of these authors writing about Nathan Hale had a strong personal agenda that influenced their accounts. Tiffany, who penned his account of Nathan Hale more than a decade after Hale's arrest, had actually been under house arrest in Connecticut's Northwest Hills at the time of Hale's capture, accused, correctly, of being a loyalist. In fact, Tiffany's manuscript History of the American Revolution, in which the Hale story appears, was an absolute diatribe against the American cause. Everything the American did was wrong. It was a prophetic Jeremiah, one of those laments, beware, the end is coming, complete with supernatural portents. It had everything. The sky is falling. It was, the end is at hand. He predicted the impending collapse of these disunited states. He wasn't the only one. A lot of people did that in that time. It was the rarest of all things, a history written by the losers, and it reflected in tone and text the bitterness of the defeated. William Hull, whose stirring account of Hale's selfless valor is the bedrock document, it's the foundation of Hale's heroic reputation, was very much unlike Consider Tiffany. He was a patriot through and through. Perhaps Hale's closest friend in the military, Hull earned his own reputation for bravery in the battles of White Plains, Trenton, Princeton, Saratoga, Fort Stanwix, Monmouth, and Stony Point, and he was honored by both George Washington and by Congress. In 1805, Hull became governor of the Michigan Territory, and at the outbreak of the War of 1812, he was made a brigadier general and the commander of the Army of the Northwest. Now, although Hull's account of Hale's execution was, like Tiffany's, based on secondhand information, Hull first heard of Hale's death the day after his execution during a flag of truce conference with a British captain named John Montresor, who had actually witnessed Hale's hanging. So he got it secondhand from someone who was there. Because he got his information so near to the actual event, one might assume that Hull's account was inherently more reliable than Consider Tiffany's. But consider this. Hull's account of Hale's death wasn't referenced by anyone until the year 1799, almost a quarter century after Hale's execution. Furthermore, it wasn't published until 49 years after that, 1848, as part of a posthumous biography of Hull himself, assembled from manuscripts. And those manuscripts, by the way, subsequently disappeared. You can't find them. The biography of Hull was written by his daughter and grandson. Now, in shaping their biography, Hull's descendants had an agenda no less forceful than Consider Tiffany's. for they were trying to repair William Hull's by then completely shattered reputation. Hull had fallen into disgrace because during the War of 1812, he had surrendered Detroit to the British without so much as firing a shot. When called to account for that, he said he reasoned that the Americans couldn't overcome the combined force of the British Army and their Indian allies, and so to fight them would lead to havoc and tremendous carnage along the Michigan frontier. So he said he'd taken the personally dishonorable course of surrendering to the enemy without a fight to achieve the virtuous outcome of not wasting American lives. So I did it to save others. Now, unfortunately for Hull, his contemporaries, including his fellow officers, didn't see his behavior the way that he had seen it. Hull was court-martialed for cowardice, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to be shot. So that's how the people who worked with him felt about what he had done. Though he was given a reprieve later by President James Madison, the disgrace didn't go away. It dogged him right up until his death in 1825. So it's safe to assume that the biography assembled by his descendants was an all-out effort to redeem Hull's reputation, and the story of Nathan Hale was central to that effort. Here's the reason why. A lot of people don't know that at the time of the American Revolution, spying was considered a completely dishonorable thing to do. Any man who would choose to be a spy, to pretend he was somebody he wasn't, to sneak in and get information, had disgraced his family, disgraced his country, disgraced everything. So Nathan Hale's decision to be a spy, he understood that. And yet, when Washington said, I need people to get information, he made the decision that he was going to do this because that had to be done. And he thought he was the right guy to do it. So he took the job on. So here's Hull, completely disgraced, his family trying to say, how can we help people understand why he did what he did? Well, by drawing a close and personal parallel between Hale and Hull, the biographers suggested that Hull's surrender of Detroit without a fight, an act considered as dishonorable as spying had been considered, could, like Hale's execution, be seen as intensely patriotic and self-sacrificing if it's viewed in the appropriate context. So, what do you conclude from this? The axe is being ground by the Hull family in their version of the Nathan Hale story were no less personal and they were no less sharp than the ones in the account rendered by considered Tiffany. And it's naive, I think, to read either Hull's or Tiffany's account of the capture and execution of Nathan Hale without being fully mindful of the agendas that informed their production. You know, interpreting the news depends on understanding the agenda of the people who are giving it to you. We've kind of figured that out today, right? Hopefully, by now. But that is part of what makes the Hale story so interesting and so timeless. The evidence about Hale is fragmentary, contradictory, and full of gaps. And because of that, historians studying Nathan Hale have to make choices when you decide to tell his story about whose evidence to believe and how best to account for those lapses in the record, which we know so little about with complete certainty. Now, this had a lot of interesting effects. It's produced accounts of Hale the hero, Hale the incompetent, Hale the naive, and I'll never forget the undergraduate student who stood up in my Connecticut history course and confidently said to his classmates, "This is the story of Hale the idiot." So, you gotta love him. Yet there's one thing upon which virtually all sources about Nathan Hale agree, and which I think should be considered the one incontrovertible point about Hale that makes him truly admirable. Yeah. At the same time, there's one usually overlooked factor about Hale that explains why, once he was captured, he was subjected to really harsh and summary justice. The way he was treated is kind of beyond belief, even as this unconsidered fact does connect him to 9/11. So let me use the rest of this talk to discuss these 2 points. Now, whether Hale was exposed by Robert Rogers or his own cousin Samuel, whether he immediately admitted his actions when he was arrested or he tried to save his skin by lying, whether he said, "I only regret I have but one life to lose for my country," or something longer and less memorable, whether he was a good spy or an incompetent spy, whether he was adequately prepared for his mission or sent as a sheep to the wolves, all of these things have been argued. There's one thing about Nathan Hale that his contemporaries, both American and British, and the historians who followed them, they've all agreed upon this. When the chips were down and it was clear that he would pay the ultimate price for his actions, 21-year-old Nathan Hale acted with courage and composure. He died a good and an honorable death as an American patriot. And for that grace under pressure, Ernest Hemingway's definition of courage in the service of liberty, Hale, I believe, is entitled to lasting honor as an American hero. And I won't waver from that one. This is especially true given the extraordinarily harsh circumstances surrounding his execution. Nathan Hale wasn't the first spy captured by either the British or the Americans, but he was the first one to be executed by either side in the War for Independence. Moreover, he was hanged within hours of his arrest, having been denied the benefit of trial by court-martial required under the English Articles of War. In his final hours, Hale was denied even access to a Bible, and his last letters, one to his commanding officer Thomas Knowlton and the other to his brother Enoch, were opened by the British, but they were never delivered. Historians trying to understand this rough justice in the case of Nathan Hale have often attributed it to the battlefield pressures faced by British commanders and to the fact that Hale had both openly confessed to being a spy and he was found with incriminating evidence on his person. Well, both of those arguments are weak. The idea that the British commander, General Howe, sentenced Hale to immediate death because he needed to get back to battle is without foundation. He was captured during a significant lull in the New York campaign. Firing had stopped almost a week before Hale's capture, after the September 16th Battle of Harlem Heights, and it wouldn't begin again in earnest until the end of October with the Battle of White Plains. So they were in a lull in the fighting. Nor should we assume that Hale's public confession abrogated the British Article of War's requirement that spies be convicted by a formal court-martial. Court-martials were designed to happen quickly, but it was procedural. It was an issue of honor that you gave a person a court-martial before you executed them. Not in this case. To find what did trigger the inhumane treatment of the condemned Hale, we have to look elsewhere. And we look to Hale's probably most ardent historian and first major one, George Dudley Seymour, who I think spent much of his life trying to preserve Hale's memory. The Hale homestead up in Coventry was the work of George Dudley Seymour, and a great biography he wrote as well. Well, he was perhaps the foremost Hale biographer. And in his description of Hale's life, he noted this. This is a quote from him. When Hale was brought to the artillery park in New York for execution, he must have seen a drifting pall of smoke rising from the great fire then raging in the city. It's to that pall of smoke and that great fire that I believe we have to look for answers. On the night of Friday, September 21st, 1776, the same evening that Robert Rogers arrested Nathan Hale, a great reddish light appeared just after midnight on the streets of southern Manhattan. The fire that was the great light's source started at a tavern near Whitehall, This is all down near Wall Street. Brisk southerly breezes quickly spread its embers to nearby houses, frames tinder dry after a long, unusually rain-free summer. In minutes, the tavern fire became a conflagration. The fire raged with inconceivable violence, a British officer later reported. Later reported, and in its destructive progress, it swept away all the buildings between Broad Street and North River, as far as King's College, a few only excepted. Long before the main fire reached Trinity Church, that large, ancient, and venerable edifice was in flames. Now, this is Trinity Church that was, really within a walking distance of the Twin Towers, and it's where they used it as a staging area for a lot of the rescue. But at that time, it had a great high wooden steeple. So the person writing about the fire says, long before the main fire reached Trinity Church, that large, ancient, and venerable edifice was in flames, which baffled every effort to suppress them. The steeple, which was 140 feet high, resembled a vast pyramid of fire, exhibiting a most awful and grand spectacle. Several women and children perished in the fire. Their shrieks joined to the roaring of the flames, the crash of falling houses, and the widespread ruin which everywhere appeared, formed a scene of horror great beyond description, which was still heightened by the darkness of that night. As terrible as this fire was, and clearly it was awful, it wasn't unexpected. The question of whether the American army would burn New York City rather than turn it over to the British when they evacuated, by now it was pretty clear they were going to have to leave at some point. Well, that question had been as thick in the air as smoke for many months. Such fears weren't without substance. From the Americans' perspective, allowing the British to make their winter quarters in a major port town while the Americans themselves were forced to fend for themselves in the frozen countryside seemed pointless, if not outright foolhardy. Prior to the Continental Army's evacuation of New York, Washington's most trusted general, Nathanael Greene, had urged him to fire the city as a strategic necessity. Here's what he said. 2/3 of the property of New York belongs to the Tories, the supporters of the king. He reminded Washington, I would burn the city and suburbs for the following reasons. 1, if the enemy takes the city, we can never recover it without a superior naval force, and that wasn't going to happen. 2, we will deprive the enemy of an opportunity of barracking their whole army together, and 3, we'll deprive them of a general market. All these advantages would result from the destruction of the city, and there's not one benefit that can arise to us from its preservation. British commanders not only expected that a retreating American army might try to torch New York, they were also certain of which group of soldiers Washington would call on to light that torch. New Englanders, unlike their New York or Pennsylvania counterparts, were strongly in favor of the city's destruction. They had long viewed New York as a kind of commercial Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't we still? Sort of. And they'd nothing but contempt for the possibility of letting that city fall under British control. As Nathan Hale's friend Gilbert Saltonstall of New London had written to him 10 months before the Great Fire, I wish New York was either razed to the foundation or strongly garrisoned by the American forces. I greatly fear the virtue of the New Yorkers whose religion is trade and whose God is gain. Well, a comment. On September 2nd, as the Americans were preparing their evacuation plans, a British officer had written home from Long Island with a really surprising message. I've just heard there's been a most dreadful fray in New York. The New Englanders insisted on setting the town on fire and retreating. This was opposed by the New Yorkers, who were joined by the Pennsylvanians, and a battle has been the consequence, in which many lost their lives. Another letter, written 2 days after that to a gentleman in London, lent credence to that story. It reported that escapees from the city had informed the British generals that Washington had ordered 3 battalions of New York provincials to leave New York, and that they should be replaced by an equal number of Connecticut troops. But the New York troops, assured that the Connecticutans would burn and destroy all the houses, refused to give up their city. Wow. How come we never heard about that? Well, these reports, intriguing as they are, say more about the rumor machines that accompany armies in the field than about Washington's intentions for New York. Not that he hadn't considered burning the city, he most certainly had. On September 2nd, the same day he was allegedly positioning troops to fire New York, Washington had written Congress asking for guidance on whether the city should be destroyed. If we should be obliged to abandon the town, ought it to stand as winter quarters for the enemy? Well, the alternative, he made clear, was the city's destruction. Congress, reasoning no doubt that should Washington actually torch New York, the British would feel free to literally fight fire with fire in any American city, or every American city, responded immediately and emphatically. Congress would have special care taken, they told Washington, that no damage be done to the said city by his troops on their leaving it. And for Washington, who embodied in his whole military career the concept of civilian control of the military, that was it. The city he evacuated 2 weeks later was left intact. Fears of an American plot to torch New York did not leave with it. New York loyalists and their liberating British military leaders continued to worry about Washington's intentions. And so, when the hell on earth swept through the city that Friday night in September, those who fought the fire and those who fled the fire automatically laid the blame to a patriot plot. And that produced truly horrific consequences. Newspaper accounts printed after the fire had destroyed over 1,000 buildings, between 20 and 25% of New York's total building stock, describe in great detail the retributions that mobs took on those they thought responsible for setting the flames. The St. James Chronicle of London, calling the fire an atrocious act, reported that one William Smith, an officer in a New England regiment, was taken with a match in his hand and sacrificed on the spot to the fury of soldiers who were fighting the fire. The Gaines's Mercury, also of London, reported several persons were discovered with large bundles of matches dipped in melted resin and brimstone, attempting to set fire to the houses. One White, a carpenter, was observed cutting the leather buckets used to carry water to the fire. This provoked the spectators to such a degree that they instantly hung him up. In the war for public opinion, the after reports published in English and Loyalist papers tried to establish conclusively that the Great Fire of New York was indeed an act of arson ordered by the American command. Thus, the persons who call themselves our friends and our protectors were the perpetrators of this atrocious deed, which in guilt and villainy is not inferior to the gunpowder plot, that great English conspiracy to kill the king. Our distress was very great before, but this disaster has increased it tenfold. Many hundreds of families have lost their all and are reduced from a state of affluence to the lowest ebb of want and wretchedness, destitute of shelter, food, or clothing. Now, although the truth of the matter can't be determined from existing evidence, most historians who have studied the source of the Great Fire of 1776 have concluded that it was started accidentally and was spread not by arsonists, but by very strong south winds blowing across Manhattan that night. As to the supposed patriot arsonists whose names appear in the Tory accounts of the fire, we're left only to speculate because their names appear only in those accounts. So maybe, we can't track them down. They may be fictitious, they may not. We just don't know. As to the burning question of whether Nathan Hale's real mission was to torch New York, as a historian William Henry Shelton argued back in 1915, most historians find the idea that Washington would send an arsonist to New York via Connecticut and Long Island is hardly credible. He had people nearby he could call on to do that. Moreover, they reasoned quite persuasively, I think, that if the British had evidence that Hale was an arsonist, they certainly wouldn't have kept it to themselves. They'd have trumpeted it both to the enraged and homeless loyalists of New York seeking revenge for their suffering. They would have said, "We got him." And maybe they did. Though Hale wasn't an arsonist, it's to that pall of smoke hanging over New York that we have to turn in order to understand the incredibly rough justice he received. New York was still smoldering, and the rage of both the army and the people over what they believed was an act of arson was still white hot. Hale, a New England officer, although captured on Long Island as a spy for gathering intelligence, nevertheless matched precisely the image of the arsonist both the British general and the loyalist citizenry had expected Washington to send. Hale might not have been an arsonist, but in the search for a symbol of revenge for arson, he did just fine. He fit the bill. It's smoldering anger over Washington's presumed use of New England troops to burn New York that explains, I think, Hale's being immediately sentenced to death without benefit of court-martial. And it's smoldering anger over Washington's presumed use of New England troops to burn New York that explains the refusal to give Hale the comfort of a Bible the Sunday morning before his death. That smoldering anger explains, I think, why the British read and refused to deliver Hale's 2 last letters. And it's smoldering anger over Washington's use of New England troops to burn New York, or his presumed use of those troops, that explains one more thing. 4 days after Hale's execution, a British officer wrote a letter from New York to a friend in England describing what had happened to Hale following his execution. "We hanged up a rebel spy the other day," he wrote, "and some soldiers got out of a rebel gentleman's garden a painted soldier on a board, and they hung it beside the rebel. And they wrote upon it, 'General Washington,' and I saw it yesterday beyond headquarters by the roadside." 4 days after the hanging. A hanging cardboard cutout soldier named Washington, and a New England spy named Nathan Hale. To New Yorkers furious at the burning of their city, that tableau provided a pure message of vengeance and revenge. Now we're different. Whenever we try to visualize Nathan Hale, I suspect almost all of us imagine him young, handsome, brave, standing on the gallows, uttering those patriotic words. But if we're fully to understand the circumstances of his execution, we have to have another image. We have to see a bloated, distorted body of that same young man hanging from a tree days later, and next to his grotesque form, a hanged, cut-out soldier with the word Washington painted on it. War does create heroes, but it also turns people into hateful, unreasoning, vengeful creatures. We've seen it in so many places in the past few years. It's everywhere. It's an epidemic. And that brings me back to the fire with which this talk began and the days of fear that followed that great attack in 9/11. The cruel and inhuman treatment of Nathan Hale by the British as a scapegoat for an enemy they thought they knew but couldn't see is a reminder of how easy it is to brand people as evil, a whole people as evil, just because of the acts of a few. And how important it is, even in times of terror, to judge carefully, cautiously, and with reason. This is a lesson which, like our freedom itself, is a gift from the sacrifice of Nathan Hale. And I thank you so much for coming to hear his story today. There you go.